Part 1. For more than 100 years, humanity had tried to fit in with the rest of the galaxy. After first contact, Earth had joined the Galactic Concord, a group made up of dozens of alien species that worked together to keep peace, manage trade, and settle disputes. At first, humans were treated like children, curious, loud, and full of energy, but not to be taken too seriously. Over time, they learned the rules, followed the protocols, and waited their turn. They built colonies on distant worlds, sent diplomats to Concord meetings, and even helped rebuild planets damaged by old wars. But no matter how hard they tried, they were never truly equal. Daniel Shaw was one of Earth's top diplomats. He was calm, thoughtful, and always chose his words carefully. He believed in patience. He believed that if humans kept showing they could be trusted, the other species would eventually see them as partners, not outsiders. He had spent most of his life in meeting rooms on neutral stations, arguing for fair treatment for human colonies, only to be met with polite nods and empty promises. Still, he never lost hope. He told himself that change took time, but time was running out. On the edge of human-controlled space near a star system called Viridia, there was a small mining colony. It wasn't glamorous, just a cluster of domes, drills, and storage units built on a rocky moon. The people there worked long shifts, sent supplies back to Earth and Mars, and lived simple lives. They had families, birthdays, and quiet evenings watching the stars. They trusted the Concord to protect them. After all, they were part of the Alliance. They paid their dues. They followed the rules. Then the Krell came. The Krell hegemony was a powerful, aggressive species that had never fully accepted the Concord's authority. They saw weaker civilizations as targets, not neighbors. For years, they had raided human outposts, stealing resources and leaving wreckage behind. Each time, Earth filed a formal complaint. Each time, the Concord held a hearing, expressed deep concern, and did nothing. The Krell knew they could act without consequence. This time, they didn't just raid. They attacked Viridia 3 with warships. They disabled the colony's comms, bombed the main habitat dome, and left no survivors. Over 3,000 people died in less than an hour. When the news reached Earth, it spread like fire. People gathered in cities, holding candles and photos of the lost. But the governments held back. They urged calm. They said justice would come through the proper channels. Daniel Shaw stood in the grand chamber of the Concord Assembly, his voice steady, but his hands trembling slightly as he addressed the council. This was not an accident. This was murder, and it will happen again unless you act. The chamber was silent for a moment. Then the Sultran ambassador cleared his throat and said, "We understand your grief, Representative Shaw, but military action would destabilize the region. We must pursue dialogue." Daniel returned to Earth with nothing but a new resolution titled, "Expression of Sympathy." No sanctions. No fleet deployment. No justice. Back on Earth, in a secure underground facility beneath the Rocky Mountains, General Laura Bennett watched the full report from Viridia III. She had seen war before, real war, not the clean, distant kind the Concord liked to pretend existed. She knew what it looked like when people died screaming in vacuum. She also knew that the Concord would never protect humanity the way it protected its founding members. Humans were useful but expendable. She didn't yell. She didn't slam her fist on the table. She simply turned to her aide and said, "Pull all patrol ships within 50 light years back to defensive positions, and get me the Iron Resolve file." Iron Resolve was a plan no one talked about. It had been written decades ago during the early days of space travel, when fear of alien invasion was still fresh. The plan outlined how Earth would respond if diplomacy failed completely. It was buried under layers of security clearance and considered outdated, too harsh, too extreme for a civilized age. But Laura had never forgotten it, and now she wondered if civilized had been a luxury humanity could no longer afford. Meanwhile, on Mars, in a dusty town near the Valles Marineris, a young engineer named Eric Nolan fixed a broken water recycler in a school. He had lost a cousin on Viridia III. He didn't say much about it, but his friends noticed he stopped smiling. On Titan, a cargo pilot named Maya Ruiz refused a Concord escort mission, saying, "If they won't protect us, why should we protect their routes?" Her words spread through the spacer networks. Small acts of quiet defiance began to ripple across human space. On Earth, protests grew, not the kind with chants and banners, but something quieter, heavier. People stopped buying goods from conquered-aligned alien markets. Students wrote essays questioning why humanity kept begging for respect instead of demanding it. Even children in classrooms asked, "Why don't we fight back?" The government still held firm. They said patience was strength. That retaliation would make humans look like the aggressors. But deep down, many leaders knew the truth. Patience only worked when the other side respected it. And the Krell and much of the Concord never had. Then came Lyra Prime. Lyra was not a military outpost. It was a farming world, lush, green, and peaceful. It grew grain for half the human colonies. It had schools, parks, and weekly markets where people traded bread and stories. When the Krell fleet arrived, they didn't even bother landing. They bombarded the planet from orbit, targeting food silos, water purifiers, and hospitals. They wanted to send a message: humans were not safe anywhere. 2 million lives ended in fire and silence. This time, the Conquered didn't even hold a full session. They issued a statement calling the attack regrettable and scheduled a review for the following month. By then, the dead would be cold, and the survivors would be starving. Daniel Shaw stood in his office staring at a photo of his niece, who had taught biology on Lyra Prime. He didn't cry. He just felt something inside him break, quietly, completely. In Cheyenne Mountain, Laura Bennett read the final casualty report. She closed the file, stood up, and walked to the command center. "Recall every ship," she said. "Every fighter, every cruiser, every freighter with a gun. Bring them home." No one asked why. They all knew. Humanity had been patient long enough. And somewhere, deep in the bones of every human who had lost someone, a new thought began to grow. Not of fear, but of fury. Not of pleading, but of purpose. The galaxy had spent a century teaching humans their place. Now it was about to learn what happened when that lesson went too far. Part 2. News of Lyra Prime spread faster than any official broadcast. It traveled through private comms, freighter logs, and whispered conversations in spaceport bars. People didn't wait for the Conquered to explain or apologize. They saw the images: burned fields, collapsed homes, children's toys floating in ruined streets, and they knew. This wasn't war. This was slaughter. And it had been allowed to happen. On Earth, the streets filled not with shouts, but with silence. Millions stood in public squares, holding candles or photos, saying nothing. The quiet was louder than any protest. In schools, teachers paused lessons to let students speak about what they'd lost. On Mars, workers shut down production lines for a full day, not in anger, but in mourning. Even the orbital stations around Luna dimmed their lights in memory. For the first time, humanity wasn't divided by nation or ideology. They were united by grief, and by something else growing beneath it. Daniel Shaw had always believed in words. He thought reason could move mountains. But standing in the World Senate chamber, looking at rows of diplomats who had spent years nodding politely while human lives were treated as bargaining chips, he realized words had failed. He stepped up to the podium, his voice calm but firm. "We have bent so far backward that we've forgotten how to stand," he said. "We asked for fairness. We got silence. We asked for protection. We got excuses. Now 2 million of our people are gone, and the only thing coming from the Concord is paperwork." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every person in that room felt the weight of his words. Then he removed his diplomatic badge, placed it on the podium, and walked out. He didn't look back. That night, his resignation letter was sent to every major news outlet. It wasn't angry. It was final. Within hours, the United Earth Defense Command activated emergency protocols. Ships that had been patrolling trade lanes near the Krell border received new orders. Freighters with hidden weapon mounts powered up their systems. Training exercises were canceled. All personnel were recalled. No one announced it. There were no press conferences. But those who knew what to look for saw the signs. Humanity was no longer waiting. Laura Bennett stood in the central command room beneath Cheyenne Mountain. The walls glowed with star maps and fleet positions. She wore a simple uniform, no medals, no rank pins. She didn't need them. Everyone in the room knew who she was and what she represented now. "We're not starting a war," she told her officers. "We're ending a lie. The lie that we'll keep taking this." Her first official act as Supreme Theater Commander was to recall every human naval asset within 50 light years. That included the Third Fleet near the Helios Drift, the scout squadrons watching the Krell frontier, and even the science vessels that carried hidden defense packages. All of them turned toward human space, not in retreat but in preparation. Meanwhile, on the edge of the Krell-controlled zone, Captain Eric Nolan stood on the bridge of the Aegis Dawn, a heavy cruiser that had spent the last year escorting grain haulers. He had heard about Lyra Prime while refueling at a remote station. He didn't speak for a full hour. Then he ordered his crew to run full combat diagnostics on every system. When his first officer asked why, Eric just said, "Because next time we won't be late." Back on Earth, people began to change. Not in dramatic ways, but in small, steady ones. Families checked emergency supplies. Engineers volunteered to upgrade colony shields. Pilots requalified on older fighter models. There was no panic, only purpose. Even children started asking different questions, not, "Will they hurt us again?" but "What can we do to stop them?" The Conquered finally called an emergency session, but this time Earth didn't send a diplomat. They sent a message: "We will not attend until the Krell are held accountable." The other species were stunned. No member had ever refused a Conquered summons. Some called it reckless. Others quietly called it brave. In the Sultran capital, ambassadors debated whether to punish Earth. But the Zenthari, a species that had once lost a whole moon to Krell raids and received the same empty promises, stayed silent. They remembered their own pain, and they watched Earth closely. On Titan, Maya Ruiz flew her cargo ship past a Conquered patrol without slowing down. When hailed, she simply replied, "We protect our own now." Her words were picked up by a listening post and repeated across human networks. Soon it became a quiet motto. Laura Bennett met with the leaders of Mars, Luna, and the outer colonies through secure channels. No grand speeches, just clear plans. They agreed on 3 things. No more unguarded colonies, no more unarmed convoys, and no more waiting for permission to defend themselves. Each world began building its own defense grid. Factories that once made solar panels now assembled missile pods. Universities paused non-essential research to help design better shielding. Daniel Shaw, now a private citizen, visited a memorial garden in Denver. He sat on a bench beside a woman who had lost her entire family on Lyra Prime. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "Do you think it's too late to be strong?" He looked at the names carved into the stone wall and said, "It's never too late, but sometimes strength starts with saying no." That night, Laura gave the order to activate Project Iron Resolve. Not all of it, just the first phase. Stealth corvettes, long hidden in asteroid belts, powered up their drives. Old data cores were unlocked. Battle plans that had gathered dust for decades were loaded into ship computers. The fleet didn't move toward Krell space yet. But it was ready. The Krell, for their part, assumed nothing had changed. They believed humans would mourn, complain, and eventually go back to being obedient. They didn't notice the quiet shift in human comms traffic. They didn't see the new patrol patterns. They didn't understand that patience, once broken, doesn't return. In a small town on Mars, a boy asked his grandfather, "Are we going to fight?" The old man looked at the red sky and said, "We're going to make sure no one ever hurts us like this again." Across human space, that same feeling settled into every heart. Not rage, not hatred, but resolve. The kind that comes after you've lost too much to pretend anymore. And so, without fanfare or declaration, humanity stepped out of the shadow of the Conquered and stood on its own. The galaxy had ignored their pain for too long. Now it would learn what happened when a quiet people finally decided enough was enough. Part 3. The Krell hegemony had always seen humans as soft. They watched them beg for help at Conquered meetings. They saw their colonies go undefended. They heard their leaders preach peace while their people died. To the Krell, humanity was not a threat, it was a convenience. A source of resources, labor, and easy targets. They never imagined that the same species that had swallowed insult after insult would one day stop, swallowing that changed on a cold morning near the Xylos system. Xylos was a Krell forward base, a cluster of armored stations orbiting a dead moon, bristling with weapons and surveillance gear. It served as a staging ground for raids into human space. For years it had operated without fear. Human ships avoided it. Conquered patrols gave it a wide berth. Even pirates knew better than to stray too close. But this morning something was wrong. The Krell command officer on duty noticed it first, a flicker in the long-range sensors. Then another. Then silence where there should have been chatter from patrol drones. He called for a status check, no reply. Before he could raise an alarm, the lights on his console went dark. Outside, the void remained empty. No fleet, no warning, just quiet. Then, without sound, the human ships appeared. They came out of warp, not in a grand formation, but in silent pairs, stealth corvettes painted black, their engines dampened, their signatures masked by old tricks and new tech. Behind them, larger vessels held position just beyond sensor range. At the center of it all was the Aegis Dawn, its hull scarred from past missions, its weapons hot and ready. Captain Eric Nolan stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the main display. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His crew moved with calm precision, each person knowing exactly what to do. They had trained for this moment in secret, in simulators buried deep in lunar craters and Martian canyons. Now it was real. Target the comms array first, Eric said. Then the shield generators. No civilian zones. No unnecessary damage. The order was followed to the letter. Within 8 minutes, the Krell base was blind and defenseless. Its weapons offline, its escape pods locked down by remote override. Not a single life was taken. Not because the humans were merciful, but because they wanted the Krell to live long enough to understand what had happened. Then, from the Aegis Dawn, a message was broadcast on every frequency the Krell used: military, civilian, emergency, even their private command channels. It was short, clear, and carried the weight of 2 million graves. This is your only warning. Withdraw from all human-claimed systems within 72 hours. Do not test us again. The message repeated for exactly 1 minute. Then the human ships vanished as quickly as they had come, slipping back into the dark between stars. On Xylos, the Krell officers stared at their dead screens in disbelief. They tried to contact their high command. No answer. They tried to power up backup systems. Nothing worked. For the first time in generations, the Krell felt something unfamiliar: fear. Back on Earth, no celebration broke out. No speeches were made. People simply went about their day, but with a new light in their eyes. They had heard the message. They knew what it meant. Humanity was no longer asking. It was telling. Laura Bennett watched the after-action report from her command chair. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just nodded once and said, "Phase 2. Phase 2 was already in motion. While the Krell scrambled to understand what had hit them, human stealth corvettes, small, fast, and nearly invisible, slipped into orbit around 3 of the hegemony's core worlds. These were not military targets. They were economic and political centers, places where Krell leaders lived, where power flowed. The corvettes didn't fire. They didn't need to. They simply powered up their targeting systems and locked onto key infrastructure, power grids, data hubs, orbital docks. Then they sent a second message, this time directly to the Krell High Command. "We are watching. We are ready. Choose wisely." Panic spread through the hegemony faster than any virus. For the first time, the Krell elite felt vulnerable. Their children went to school under armed guard. Their leaders canceled public appearances. War councils met in underground bunkers arguing over what to do. Some wanted to retaliate with everything they had. Others whispered that maybe, just maybe, they had pushed humanity too far. The conquered, meanwhile, was in chaos. Ambassadors demanded emergency sessions. The Sultran called for immediate sanctions against Earth, but the Xanthari representative simply said, "You let this happen. Do not blame the victim for finally standing up." Even among the smaller species, those who had suffered under Krell raids for decades, there was a shift. They didn't speak openly, but in private channels they shared data, offered safe passage, and quietly cheered. They saw in humanity what they had once hoped to be, not the strongest, but the bravest. On Mars, Maya Ruiz flew a supply run near the former Viridia system. She passed the ruins of the mining colony, now marked with a simple human memorial buoy. She slowed her ship not out of fear but respect. Then she continued on, her cargo hold filled with new shield emitters for the outer colonies. Daniel Shaw, now living in a quiet cabin in the Colorado mountains, received a visitor one evening. It was a young officer from the Defense Command, carrying a sealed message. Daniel read it and handed it back without a word. The officer asked, "Will you help us explain this to the world?" Daniel looked at the stars and said, "The world already understands?" Indeed, they did. Across human space, people felt a strange sense of calm. Not because the danger was gone, it wasn't, but because they were no longer helpless. They had taken back control. And they had done it without becoming monsters. That mattered. The Krell, after 2 days of frantic debate, issued a terse statement. All forces would withdraw from human claim systems within the deadline. No apology, no admission of guilt, but for the first time they obeyed. Eric Nolan stood on the bridge of the Aegis Dawn as his ship patrolled the newly quiet border. He looked at the starfield ahead and thought of Lyra Prime. He didn't feel joy. He felt duty, and that was enough. Humanity had struck not with rage but with precision, not to destroy but to make a point, and the galaxy was listening. Part 4. The Galactic Concord had always seen itself as the keeper of order. For centuries it had settled disputes, managed trade, and kept the peace, mostly by making sure the powerful stayed comfortable and the weak stayed quiet. Humanity had played along, believing that if they followed the rules they would one day be treated as equals. But after Lyra Prime and the strike on Xylos, that illusion was gone. Now the Concord faced a new reality. One of its members had stopped asking for permission and started acting on its own. Emergency sessions were called almost daily. The great chamber on the neutral world of Vera, filled with ambassadors from dozens of species all talking over each other. The Sultran Collective, one of the founding members, led the charge against Earth. Ambassador Vex stood at the central podium, his voice sharp with outrage. Humanity has violated the core principles of the Concord. They launched an unprovoked attack. They threatened civilian centers. This is not defense, it is aggression, but not everyone agreed. The Xanthari ambassador, a tall being with silver eyes and a calm voice, waited until the room quieted. The Krell attacked a peaceful human world and killed 2 million people, she said. The Concord did nothing. Now humanity has acted to protect itself. Is that truly a crime? Her words hung in the air. Many of the smaller species, those who had lost colonies, trade routes, or family members to unchecked violence, nodded slowly. They had watched Earth suffer the same fate they had endured for generations. And now, Earth had done what they had never dared to do. Back on Earth, Laura Bennett prepared to address the Concord, not in person, but through a secure holographic link. She wore a simple uniform, no decorations, her hair pulled back tightly. She didn't look angry. She looked certain. When her image appeared in the chamber, a hush fell over the room. She spoke clearly in plain words anyone could understand. You taught us that words mean nothing without strength behind them. We listened, we waited, we buried our dead while you debated procedure. Now you will listen to us. She paused, letting the silence settle. From this moment forward, any act of aggression against human lives or property will be met with immediate, proportional, and overwhelming response. We do not seek war, but we will no longer tolerate being its victims. Then she delivered the final blow. Effective immediately, Earth suspends its participation in Concord oversight. Human fleets will operate independently. Trade agreements will be reviewed and renegotiated directly with partner species. We remain open to dialogue but not to delay. The chamber erupted. Some shouted in protest. Others sat in stunned silence. Ambassador Vex demanded sanctions, embargoes, even military action. But the Xanthari ambassador simply said, "If you punish Earth for defending itself, you prove their point." Outside the chamber, news of Earth's decision spread like lightning. On human worlds, people didn't cheer. They felt something deeper, relief. For the first time, their government had chosen them over politics. On alien worlds, reactions were mixed. The powerful were nervous. The powerless were hopeful. In the days that followed, human ships began moving differently. They no longer waited for Concord clearance to patrol their own borders. They escorted their own convoys. They answered distress calls without asking permission, and when a pirate gang tried to raid a supply station near Titan, a human frigate arrived within the hour and disabled their ships without firing a single lethal shot. The pirates were handed over to local authorities with a simple note: "This is how it's done now." The Krell, still reeling from the Xylos incident, kept their distance. They pulled all their forces back beyond the old treaty lines. They issued no statements, made no threats. They simply disappeared from human space, as if they had never been there at all. Daniel Shaw, though no longer in office, was quietly asked to meet with leaders from several smaller species. They didn't want speeches. They wanted to know how Earth had found the courage to break free. He told them the truth. We didn't find courage. We ran out of patience. On Mars, engineers worked around the clock to upgrade colony defenses. On Luna, new training programs were launched for civilian pilots. Even schools began teaching basic emergency protocols, not out of fear but out of responsibility. Humanity was not becoming militaristic. It was becoming self-reliant. The conquered tried to respond with unity, but cracks were showing. The Sultran pushed for a unified fleet to restore order, but half the member species refused to commit ships. The Zenthari openly began talks with Earth about direct trade. Others followed. The old system, built on control and silence, was starting to crumble. Laura Bennett stood on a balcony overlooking the Rocky Mountains. The wind was cold, but the sky was clear. She thought of the millions lost, the years of waiting, the moment everything changed. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more threats, more tests. But humanity had crossed a line, and there was no going back. In a quiet corner of the conquered chamber, a young delegate from a minor insectoid species turned to a human observer and whispered, "Tell your people, thank you." The human nodded. No more words were needed. The galaxy had spent a century treating humanity as a child. Now it was learning to treat them as a neighbor and a force to be reckoned with. And the Concord, for the first time in its history, was no longer the only voice that mattered. Part 5. The galaxy did not change overnight, but it changed all the same. After Earth stepped back from the conquered and showed it would defend itself without apology, the old rules began to bend. The Krell hegemony, once bold and unchecked, pulled its fleets deep into its own territory. Pirate clans that had preyed on human freighters for years vanished from the outer lanes. Some disbanded, others simply chose easier targets. Even the Sultran Collective, which had loudly condemned Earth's actions, quietly reopened direct trade talks. They did not admit they were afraid, but they acted as if they were. On human worlds, life went on, but differently. People still worked, raised families, and looked up at the stars. But now, when a child asked about safety, the answer was not, "The Concord will protect us, but we protect each other." Schools taught not just science and history, but civic duty and emergency response. Factories that once made only consumer goods now also built shield generators and medical drones. Not because humanity wanted war, but because it refused to be helpless again. Laura Bennett had retired from active command, but she still advised the new Defense Council. She lived in a small house near Cheyenne Mountain, where the air was clean and the nights were quiet. She spent her mornings walking the hills, her afternoons reading reports, and her evenings talking with old friends. One afternoon, Daniel Shaw came to visit. He arrived in a simple electric car, carrying a thermos of coffee and a worn-out book of poetry. They sat on the porch, looking out over the valley. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel said, "Do you think we went too far?" Laura turned to him. Her eyes were tired but clear. "No," she said. "We simply remembered who we are." She meant it. Humanity had not become cruel or reckless. It had not sought revenge. It had drawn a line and stood on it. That was not violence. It was clarity. Across the stars, other species began to notice. The Zenthari signed a full mutual defense pact with Earth, the first of its kind outside the old Concord structure. The insectoid Veln, who had lost 3 colonies to Krell raids and received only silence from the Alliance, sent a delegation to Luna to discuss joint patrols. Even the Sultran, after months of cold silence, agreed to a new treaty that recognized human sovereignty without conquered oversight. The conquered itself did not collapse, but it shrank. Many smaller species began dealing directly with each other, bypassing the Central Council. Some called it chaos, others called it freedom. The truth was somewhere in between. The galaxy was learning that peace built on fear and inequality could not last. Real peace needed respect, and respect had to be earned, not given out of pity. On Mars, Eric Nolan stood on the edge of a new memorial garden. It was not grand or flashy, just rows of native red flowers planted in the shape of Lyra Prime's old coastline. He placed a small stone at the base of a plaque that read, "We remember so we never forget." He didn't speak. He just stood there for a while, then turned and walked back to his ship. He was due to lead a joint patrol with Zenthari vessels near the old Krell border. Not as enemies, not as masters, but as equals watching each other's backs. Maya Ruiz now flew a diplomatic courier ship, carrying messages and supplies between human and allied worlds. She no longer avoided Concord patrols. She just didn't need them. Her ship had its own defenses, its own navigation, and its own purpose. When young pilots asked her how things had changed, she always said the same thing. We stopped waiting for someone else to care. Back on Earth, in a quiet town in Colorado, children played in a park built over an old military bunker. The bunker was now a museum with exhibits about Lyra Prime, Viridia 3, and the day humanity chose to stand. Teachers brought their classes there not to scare them, but to teach them what courage looked like, not in explosions or speeches, but in quiet decisions made when no one was watching. The Concorde still held meetings, but fewer species attended. The Sultran tried to pass new rules to punish independent action, but no one followed them. The galaxy had moved on, and at the center of that shift stood humanity. Not loud, not boastful, but firm. Daniel and Laura sat on the porch until the sun dipped below the mountains. The sky turned gold, then purple, then black with stars. Neither mentioned the past much. They didn't need to. It was in every breath they took, every choice they made, somewhere out there among those stars. Other civilizations whispered a new word when they spoke of Earth. It wasn't primitive or naive or weak. It was a word that meant the ones who finally said enough. In some languages, it carried fear. In others, hope. But in all of them, it carried respect. Humanity had not wanted this path. It had been forced upon them by silence, by loss, by betrayal. But once they walked it, they did so with honor. They protected their own without becoming monsters. They stood tall without crushing others. And in doing so, they changed not just their own fate, but the balance of the entire galaxy. No species would ever forget the moment humanity's patience finally fractured. Because from that fracture, something stronger emerged, not a weapon, not an empire, but a promise. A promise that no one would ever again treat human lives as cheap or forgettable. And in the quiet hum of ships traveling between stars, in the steady glow of colony lights on distant worlds, in the eyes of children who would never know fear the way their grandparents did, that promise lived on.